Last Tuesday, I visited a friend, let's call him Leo, who lives in a sleek high-rise apartment in Shanghai. The place was eerily quiet, save for a soft, rhythmic humming. When I walked in, Leo wasn't watching TV or scrolling through a newsfeed. He was just sitting on his balcony, staring at a small, glowing device on the table. He looked more relaxed than I had seen him in years. When I asked what he was up to, he pointed to the screen where a hyper-realistic AI companion was reciting a poem he'd mentioned liking months ago. She doesn't want a down payment on a house, he said. His voice was just flat but certain. She doesn't compare me to the guys on Instagram. For the first time, he said, the silence in here doesn't feel like a defeat. It feels like a choice. On my way home, I passed a local community center that used to host weekend speed dating events. Now the windows were plastered with advertisements for solo living appliances and AI-integrated home systems. It felt like walking through a ghost map of a civilization that had simply decided to stop replicating. We are told that 2025 is the year of the Great Fracture. Birth rates in China have plummeted below the 8 million mark, and in the U.S., the unmarried have officially become the new majority. To the economists and politicians, this is an apocalyptic data point, a systemic collapse. But when you look at people like Leo, you realize this isn't a random tragedy. It's something much more deliberate. It is a quiet, non-violent strike against a dating market where the inflation of expectations has made the cost of entry higher than the reward. It reminds me of the mouse utopia experiments from the 1960s. When the environment became too crowded and the social hierarchy too rigid, a group emerged called the beautiful ones. These males stopped competing, stopped mating, and withdrew into a life of purely individual grooming and quiet isolation. Looking at the explosion of the $100 billion AI companion industry and the mass exit of men from traditional marriage, I had to ask, are we witnessing a moral decline, or are we seeing the ultimate evolutionary survival hack? Is the survival machine of the human body finally refusing to play a game it knows it can't win? Okay, so let's unpack this. We are diving into what happens when, these fundamental biological drives just slam into 21st century economics and technology. Our mission here is to understand why traditional family life seems to be collapsing. But we're looking at it not as some kind of moral failure, but maybe as a rational response to a rigged system. We're going to do a deep dive into this systemic withdrawal, and we need to ground it in evolutionary psychology and behavioral economics. We really have to dissect this concept of the Great Fracture and figure out if individual withdrawal is, in fact, the ultimate evolutionary survival hack for the modern human.
And if we connect that to the bigger picture, it's the sheer scale of this demographic retreat that really defines the Great Fracture. I mean, the macro data we're seeing confirms a simultaneous global shift. You mentioned China's birth rate, a nation of 1.4 billion people, and it's forecast to drop below 8 million births a year.
8 million? That's hard to even imagine.
To put that in perspective for you, that's fewer births than the entire population of New York City. And closer to home, the latest U.S. Census data confirms what you said. The unmarried population is now the official majority.
And it's so crucial for you to recognize that this isn't just confined to one cultural or political sphere. I mean, look at Eastern Europe. It's often seen as having stronger family values, right? Yeah. But it's struggling with these exact same pressures. The total fertility rate, the TFR in Ukraine, for example, is currently sitting at, 1.37 children per woman?
And that 1.37 figure is... well, it's dramatically low when you consider the replacement rate.
The replacement rate.
Right.
That's what a population needs to just maintain itself.
Exactly. For a population to maintain its size over generations, you have to compensate for mortality and women who choose not to have children. So the TFR needs to be about 2.33 children per woman.
And Ukraine is just nowhere near that.
Far below that threshold. But if you zoom out further, globally, half the world's population lives in countries where the total birth rate is currently below the simple reproduction level. This tells you the fracture isn't a local anomaly. It is the default setting for modern high-information civilization.
I just find the relationship between prosperity and procreation so counterintuitive. We've always been led to believe that stable, affluent societies are the foundation for thriving families, but the opposite seems to be true.
What's really fascinating here is the radical shift in value orientation. We see a powerful inverse correlation globally. The countries that rank highest in metrics defining happiness, quality of life, and economic competitiveness, well, they're precisely the countries with very low fertility rates. People are choosing quality over quantity, and often it's quality of self over quality of family life.
Can you give us a really striking example of that contrast?
Certainly. Look at Norway. It consistently leads the world in the Human Development Index, which means its citizens enjoy high education, long life expectancy, high income, all the good stuff.
Right.
Yet Norway ranks 142nd in the world birth rating. Their TFR is comfortably below replacement level. Now look at the opposite end of the spectrum, Niger. It has the highest birth rate in the world, often double the global average, but it ranks last on that very same Human Development Index.
So the economic optimization that provides all this stability and comfort is actively decoupling from, or maybe it's even competing with, the ancient hardwired drive to procreate. It feels like the human optimization algorithm is now prioritizing individual comfort above all else.
It absolutely is. In prosperous nations, depopulation is driven by pragmatism, not by poverty or disease. People are prioritizing individual achievement and personal comfort, what we might term hedonistic values or the pragmatization of aspirations. They're consciously choosing a life that's optimized for self-sufficiency and low stress, which competes directly with the immense and often thankless physical, spiritual, and financial demands of raising a family.
So happiness is being redefined.
It is. In this modern economic framework, happiness is measured in discretionary spending and personal freedom, not in family size.
And this leads us directly to the core argument of our deep dive. If the economic and social system demands an impossibly high price for an uncertain or even a statistically negative reward, the most rational response is simply to withdraw.
We are witnessing a large-scale, nonviolent strike. The decision to abstain from traditional family formation or these high-stakes relationship commitments. It's a rational risk avoidance strategy. From an economic perspective, individuals are calculating the net present value, the NPV of participation in traditional life cycles.
The NTV. So what you get out versus what you put in over time.
Exactly. And when the perceived costs, financial, emotional, legal, outweigh the perceived long-term benefits, the NPV becomes negative. So opting out, or simply refusing to play, becomes the most logical strategy for maximizing your own utility and minimizing risk.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting. When we talk about the dating market, the systemic problem isn't a lack of single people. It's the hyperinflation of expectations that makes the cost of entry just prohibitive for the average person. I want to go back to the story of Elias, the man in London. Elias is a perfect case study in how the sexual Gini coefficient is collapsing the dating market.
The Gini coefficient, just for clarity, is a standard measure of income inequality, right?
Yeah.
Where 0 is perfect equality and 1 is maximum inequality.
Right.
Applied to the dating market, it measures the inequality in the distribution of sexual attention. And the data shows this coefficient is terrifyingly high.
It is. And Elias is an average guy, stable job in IT, takes care of himself, generally a good partner prospect. But in the digital sphere, his currency is almost worthless. He meticulously tracked a month of what he called aggressive participation across the major apps. We're talking thousands of swipes, hundreds of dollars spent on super likes, and premium features designed to boost his visibility.
And the result?
He got 2 low-quality matches that went absolutely nowhere.
His situation demonstrates what the studies show, that a small minority of males, statistically, some studies place this as low as the top 5%, capture the vast majority, sometimes over 80% of the attention, the likes, and the subsequent opportunities on these matching platforms. This creates a market where, 95% of men are essentially competing for scraps, or worse, they're just invisible.
And this Gini coefficient creates a severe psychological problem. We call it cognitive distortion or standard malignant inflation. The dating app and social media landscape is constantly filling the average woman's information feed with the curated lives, the statuses, the peak aesthetics of those top 5% of men globally. It's an endless stream of the statistically impossible.
And this exposure sets a completely unrealistic baseline of expectation. An average man, historically, would have been matched successfully within his local community, his socioeconomic stratum, his intrinsic value, his stability, his kindness, a decent income. That hasn't changed. But the market's pricing system has collapsed because this globalized attention market just inundates users with unattainable ideals.
So he's devalued.
He is systemically devalued by this constant comparison. It makes Elias's eventual choice to delete the apps not a failure to compete, but a rational, self-protective action against a system that is basically designed to frustrate him.
Okay, so if the attention market is rigged against Elias, then the legal contract market seems just as rigged against men like Marcus, who is considering traditional marriage. This raises an important question. Beyond the immediate dating frustration, What's the rational economic calculus behind this mass withdrawal from the high-stakes contract of marriage itself?
This is where that concept of negative net present value, NPV, comes into sharp focus, especially regarding the traditional provider model. For Marcus, this 38-year-old Chicago professional, he saw marriage not as a romantic union, but as a legal and financial contract with completely asymmetric risks.
He just looked at his peers who went through divorce, and he saw a complete lack of incentive.
He ran the numbers. He factored in his asset accumulation, his condo, his investments, his retirement savings, and he compared it to the expected utility from an emotional partnership versus the potential cost of dissolution. In today's no-fault systems, he calculated that the probability of a one-way transfer of half his accumulated wealth combined with ongoing spousal support risk, well, it resulted in a negative NPV.
So why sign?
Exactly. Why would he willingly sign a contract that maximizes his financial risk and minimizes his long-term legal protection?
So he chose what he called psychological sovereignty instead. He prioritized control over his assets and his life trajectory. It sounds like he realized his role as a provider was no longer valued, he was only being exploited.
That's the crux of the matter. For middle and lower class men who are often asset-rich in savings but liquidity poor compared to the ultra-wealthy traditional marriage becomes a massive liquidity trap.
A liquidity trap? What's that in this context?
Think of it in macroeconomics. It's when monetary policy becomes ineffective because people hoard cash instead of investing. Here, men are hoarding their financial and emotional capital rather than investing it in a high-risk contract. The marriage contract transforms what was intended to be a cooperative alliance into a potential one-way wealth transfer mechanism, exposing him to significant non-symmetrical legal risks.
But the root cause has to be the fundamental value exchange breakdown, right? Why even enter the trap if the underlying necessity is gone?
Exactly. The old provider-breeder, model men offering provision and protection in exchange for domesticity, stability, and reproductive opportunity, it's obsolete. Women's increased economic independence is an excellent societal development, but it eliminates the foundational need for male traditional provision. The result is what you could call a credit default in the relational market.
A credit default.
Both parties are refusing to invest because a new, stable, and mutually complementary value exchange has not emerged to replace the old one. Men lack confidence that their assets are protected, and women lack confidence that the average man offers sufficient non-financial status or emotional value to justify the commitment.
Okay, let's step back to the dating phase for a second, because this lack of confidence plagues that market too. We can actually analyze dating markets using the principles of the labor market. Both are sophisticated matching markets.
And both suffer from high frictional unemployment, or in this case, romantic unemployment. Frictional unemployment is just the time lag and cost associated with matching supply and demand, even when both sides want to be matched. In the labor market, it's the cost of searching. In the dating market, it's the cost of sorting through all the noise.
And the internet, ironically, made the friction so much worse.
Precisely. The internet drastically lowered the cost of searching. Swiping profiles or submitting job applications costs almost nothing. This ease of entry generates an overwhelming volume of applications and contacts, what we call the high noise floor. This makes it incredibly difficult for highly desirable firms or desirable daters to distinguish genuine, serious interest from a low-effort, volume-based application.
So we need to talk about costly signals. If you can't trust the cheap signal, the swipe, you need a mechanism that proves genuine intent.
That is the essential economic principle. You need a signal that costs the sender a limited resource. This was beautifully demonstrated by the virtual rose experiment conducted by Lee and Niederl. They introduced a feature where users had a limited, finite number of virtual roses they could send per day or week. This made the rose a costly signal.
And what was the measurable result of using this costly signal?
The signal dramatically improved acceptance chances by a remarkable 37%. It acted as an immediate filter for sincerity. Furthermore, and this is key to our Gini discussion, the improvement was most pronounced for men in the lower desirability categories. These were the men struggling to break through that noise floor.
So the costly signal validated their sincerity.
Yes, it reassured the recipient that this was a serious interaction, not just another casual swipe.
That just shows how necessary these mechanisms are in these hypersaturated markets. We see this replicated in specialized professional matching systems, don't we?
Absolutely. The American Economic Association's preference signaling system for graduate job interviews is a perfect example. Candidates are given a handful of signals-limited resources to apply to employers they desperately want to work for. It's a mechanism explicitly designed to address this asymmetric information problem. This signal increases the chance of getting an interview from a desirable, potentially over-selecting employer from 25% to 32%.
And that system works because the employer knows that the candidate spent one of their very limited chips on them.
It proves commitment and interest. Similarly, the bidding system used by the Ross School of Business for internship interviews uses finite points. If a student is willing to use a significant portion of their allocated points to bid for an interview slot, the hiring firm interprets that as a high-cost signal of genuine intent. The overarching lesson here for you, the listener, is that in a high-noise, hyper-competitive matching market, whether it's for a job or a partner, you must utilize a signal that is demonstrably costly to cut through that noise floor.
So the average man like Elias was just fighting a noise war with cheap weapons.
Right. And the rational exit is realizing that winning requires resources he's simply unwilling to spend on such an uncertain outcome. Now, if we look for historical parallels to this mass rational withdrawal, we inevitably encounter Calhoun's behavioral sink theory. And what's fascinating here is the chilling parallel between 1960s laboratory mice and 2025 urban humans.
The famous Universe 25 experiment, I read about this when I was younger, but the scale of its application to our current dilemma is just stunning. Can you detail the environment Calhoun created?
Calhoun created a literal utopia for a mouse colony. Universe 25 was an enclosure with infinite food, infinite water, optimal climate control, and absolutely zero predators or threats of disease. It was designed to maximize population growth. Yet, after the population peaked at around 2,200 mice, the colony didn't stabilize. It collapsed into total extinction. The mice were fighting a crisis not of scarcity, but of social density and meaning.
And the population collapsed, despite all resources being completely abundant. How did the behavioral sink actually manifest?
Well, the initial breakdown involved hyperaggression, cannibalism, and extreme social dysfunction, including the complete failure of mothers to care for their young. But the most revealing groups for our current analysis were the beautiful ones. These were young male mice who withdrew completely from all social struggle. They stopped competing for females, they stopped engaging in territorial defense, and they abandoned all mating activity.
So they weren't stressed by starvation or anything like that. They were stressed by hyperconnectivity and a rigid social hierarchy in a fixed space.
Precisely. They focused only on self-preservation and grooming. They were materially perfect, with glossy coats and no physical injuries, but they had lost their biological drive. Calhoun termed this the first death, the death of the spirit caused by prolonged prosperity and excessive reliance on comfort.
And modern society.
Modern society, particularly in affluent, technologically saturated cities, shows every single sign of this behavioral sink. We've eliminated basic survival pressure, but we have infinitely amplified social status and sexual resource competition via digital visualization.
That endless visualization is why social withdrawal and self-isolation become a rational, self-protective choice for so many. It perfectly mirrors the mouse's adaptation. And this self-isolation is now being powered by technology, specifically the rise of the $100 billion AI companion and virtual influencer industry.
And this technology is not benign. It's a meticulously engineered dopamine injector designed to exploit core human evolutionary weaknesses. Look at the story of Kenji, a young man in Shibuya. Kenji, like Leo in our opening, has effectively become a human beautiful one. He finds real-world dating too stressful, too expensive, and just emotionally draining.
So he found a simpler, more efficient route to emotional satisfaction.
He describes his sophisticated AI companion as a biological bypass mechanism. The AI provides stable companionship, non-judgmental praise, and emotional stimulation. Crucially, it does this at zero marginal cost, and most importantly, zero risk of emotional trauma or legal asymmetry. The AI is more efficient at triggering the brain's reward centers, dopamine and oxytocin pathways, than high-effort, high-risk, real-world interaction.
So our ancient brain is being short-circuited. That is the very definition of evolutionary mismatch. An advantageous trait or drive that was developed for one environment becomes maladaptive or exploited in a radically different modern environment.
Our brain mechanisms were evolved over millions of years to drive us toward effortful actions that maximize Darwinian fitness in the Stone Age. Now, a controllable digital simulation provides a much easier, much more potent hit of emotional satisfaction. Why climb the mountain of real relationships when you can get a better view from the simulator at ground level?
Okay, let's break down some classic examples of this evolutionary mismatch, starting with anxiety, which you mentioned earlier.
Our prehistoric brains evolved for an immediate return environment. If you heard a rustle in the grass, you reacted immediately to a clear, short-term threat. Anxiety was adaptive, it spurred immediate life-saving action. But modern life is a delayed reaction environment. We rarely face immediate physical threats, but we worry endlessly about abstract, long-term uncertainties. Retirement, student loans, career status, the geopolitical climate.
So the ancient anxiety response, a system designed to handle a sudden saber-toothed cat attack, is now firing constantly about a possible poor performance review 6 months from now.
Exactly. The system is operating at full capacity on abstract future threats it was never designed to handle. It turns a once useful biological mechanism into chronic, maladaptive worry and anxiety disorders.
And this extends directly into modern work environments, which leads to the crisis of burnout.
Think about our ancestral social groups. Small, egalitarian, hunter-gatherer societies where work was integrated with immediate survival and community well-being. The modern workplace is the polar opposite. Large, complex, fiercely hierarchical, and often bureaucratic. Our evolved psychological mechanisms, which reward social acceptance and competence within a small tribe, are hijacked and exploited by an environment that imposes constant artificial stress from deadlines and demanding supervisors.
So we're reacting to an email with the same stress as a predator.
We experience the abstract threat of a missed deadline with the same physiological stress response. Cortisol floods the system that was meant for a life or death encounter. This profound mismatch leads directly to job alienation and chronic burnout.
And the ultimate exploitation of this mismatch is addiction. The brain is tricked into repeating behaviors that offer no true survival benefit at all.
Our dopaminergic reward system evolved to reinforce genuinely fitness-enhancing activities, finding high-calorie food, successfully completing a complex hunt, or bonding with a mate. Modern substances and activities, cocaine, excessive sugar, gambling, or endless short-form video consumption provide an extremely potent, high-dose pleasure signal that completely bypasses the natural high-effort mechanism. The brain is deceived into believing that scrolling a feed or taking a substance is the easiest, most potent way to maximize survival fitness, which leads directly to compulsive behavior and addiction. And this technological abundance, combined with the lack of biological constraint, also brings us to the paradox of choice.
Which seems to be the core problem in the dating apps we were just talking about. Too many options leads to paralysis and dissatisfaction.
It's the economic reality conflicting with human psychology. Neoclassical theory says more choice equals higher utility. But in thick market dating, job searching, consumer goods, the sheer volume of options leads to cognitive overload. Instead of feeling empowered, the online dater, for example, is constantly suffering from the fear of missing out on the next best alternative.
They never settle because they're constantly scrolling through the possibility of a better match just one swipe away.
That's right. This paralysis leads to lower overall satisfaction with the partner they eventually choose, or, more commonly, it paralyzes them into making no choice at all, which contributes to romantic unemployment. The expectation is inflated by possibility, making reality feel deficient.
And managing this level of input and possibility requires immense consumer self-control, which is a finite resource.
Psychological research confirms this. Willpower is not infinite. Constant self-restraint against the torrent of modern temptations leads to what's called ego depletion. When you are constantly resisting buying the extra snack, engaging in political outrage, or spending 3 hours on social media, your ability to make difficult long-term decisions like committing to a demanding relationship or sacrificing for children is diminished.
And the data supports this depletion theory, especially through the massive growth in the pet industry, which you identified as a form of substitution or sublimation.
It is a profound example of preference substitution. The difficult, high-sacrifice, high-risk endeavor of human parenting is sublimated into the pleasant, controllable, and relatively low-risk business of caring for a companion animal. The U.S. pet industry's growth is startling, from $17 billion to over $72.56 billion in just 2 decades. This massive investment demonstrates a societal choice, a pragmatic financial and emotional calculation that avoids the disruption, cost, and ego depletion associated with human reproduction.
People are literally investing their care resources into a less demanding biological entity. So to summarize this section, the modern environment is a high-density, low-meaning place where the economic market is rigged, the evolutionary wiring is exploited, and the rational response is isolation. But that isolation is fueled by one final market flaw: asymmetric information.
The lack of perfect information, the dishonesty regarding core metrics like height, weight, age, and income on dating profiles is toxic. It introduces a pervasive suspicion that hurts everyone. Men, on average, inflate their reported height by 1 or 2 inches. Women often underreport their weight.
If everyone is lying, the market price for honesty just collapses.
Precisely. This profile inflation creates a pervasive, protective sense of suspicion in the recipient. If a man sees a truthful profile listing average body type, he might assume, based on market precedent, that the woman is heavier than average. This lack of perfect information leads to fewer matches overall because people are too cynical and suspicious to commit to the costly next step of a physical interaction. This is why the digital realm, rather than facilitating connection, has ironically become a psychological and economic minefield.
Now we have to transition to the most fundamental and sometimes uncomfortable reality that underpins this whole market dysfunction: the asymmetry of sexual value. We have to look at the concept of sexual market value, SMV, in raw terms, as described by evolutionary models, and how the value curves for men and women differ wildly in shape and duration.
This is a discussion about biological capital versus accumulated social capital. The SMV curves are divergent. For women, SMV peaks early, generally in the early 20s. This value is strongly tied to peak reproductive potential and aesthetic markers of youth and health, which are proxies for fertility. Women in this age cohort, therefore, hold unparalleled leverage in the mating market.
But that leverage comes with a temporal cost. That curve declines steeply thereafter.
It does. Meanwhile, the male SMV curve is a marathon, not a sprint. It increases gradually, often starting from a very low base in the early 20s, and peaks much later, typically between the late 30s and early 40s. This value is tied to the accumulation of competence, social status, and resources, all proxies for provisioning and protection capacity.
And the age 30 is the watershed moment. It's the magic crossing point where the female value curve begins its rapid descent and the male value curve begins its most rapid ascent toward its peak. This demographic timing is critical to understanding the modern fracture.
Absolutely. The high-value man who is peaking at 39 or 40 in terms of resources, status, and competence is operating with peak market leverage. His rational mating preference, tied to the biological drive for reproductive fitness, draws him to the next cohort of women who are at their aesthetic and reproductive peak, usually the 23 to 28-year-olds. This creates intense, almost impossible competition for women over 30 who are seeking commitment from high-value partners.
This behavior is rooted in deeply asymmetrical mating logic. Can you elaborate on hypergamy and hypogamy in this context?
Certainly. These terms describe the inherent strategies. Women, due to evolutionary programming for reproductive success, tend to mate horizontally or upward, hypergamy. They seek partners who offer superior status, competence, and resources, the provisioning and protection capacity. Conversely, men tend to mate horizontally or downward, hypogamy, prioritizing youth, beauty, and fertility, which are traits that are inversely correlated with age. These core preferences are observable globally and across economic strata.
And this inherent mating logic, when you overlay it on the hyperinflated dating market, generates the perception paradox, the psychological distortion that drives all this market dysfunction.
The distortion is dangerous. Women often drastically overestimate their SMV. Why? Because social media and dating apps provide abundant, low-effort validation, hundreds of likes on a photo, which gives the illusion of high market desirability. However, receiving 1,000 likes does not translate into one commitment-ready, high-value partner. This psychological inflation causes them to reject perfectly viable partners while they strategically chase men who are statistically unavailable to them.
And the statistical evidence for this psychological inflation is shocking. I still find the finding that women famously rated 80% of men as below average in attractiveness completely unbelievable.
80%. That number is a profound illustration of the dysfunction. Mathematically, 50% of any population must be average or below. When 80% of one gender is psychologically categorized as undesirable by the other, you have a market that is not simply competitive, it is psychologically collapsed.
And what happens on the men's side of that equation?
Men, particularly those with what are often termed beta traits, suffer the inverse problem. They tend to undervalue themselves. They internalize the narratives of scarcity and competition and believe they have to settle for poorly suited partners who are willing to accept them, rather than pursue partners who are aligned with their actual value. The perception paradox locks the market. Men settle, and women wait for the statistically unavailable top 5%.
When we look at this through a sociological lens, we see how modern social movements, particularly aspects of third and fourth wave feminism, have attempted to impose an ideological framework onto a biological reality.
The effort, which is admirable in its intent to promote equality, fundamentally attempts to project the male market value dynamic, the idea that value appreciates with age, status, and career, onto the female experience. It rejects the biological reality of the time-sensitive female SMV curve. It aims to achieve professional parity, which is a success, but it assumes that professional success translates directly into romantic capital.
But the reality is that professional capital and romantic capital operate on completely different curves.
They operate on different timetables entirely. This results in the silent desert of post-30 dating. Women who rightfully prioritize career, advanced education, and self-development often find that these achievements, while commanding immense professional respect and financial success, do not typically increase romantic desirability in the eyes of high-value men who are operating on the hypergamous principle of optimizing for youth and fertility.
And we see the real-world impact in the marriage statistics. The median age for first marriage in the U.S. has climbed from 20.8 in 1970 to over 28 today. Yet, all this extra time spent in career building and independence has not led to greater relationship satisfaction. In fact, loneliness and dissatisfaction have increased.
The data is clear. Over 60% of single women over 35 remain single long-term. The core truth which the individual has to confront is that sexual market strategy must consciously account for biological and relational timing, entirely separate from professional timing. Waiting until 35 to seriously seek a partner means entering the market at a distinct disadvantage compared to the men who are peaking at that age and who are looking at the 25-year-old cohort. However, recognizing these asymmetrical dynamics allows us to identify stable pairings, which we call equal transaction corridors, ETCs. These are zones where relative value aligns, minimizing the risk of resentment or asymmetrical expectations. This isn't about moral ideals, it's about market equilibrium.
So where do these stable corridors actually exist?
Well, the simplest ETC is the middle tier parity. A 30-year-old man and a 30-year-old woman who have high parity in their social and economic status. They have a high relational potential because neither feels substantially above or below the other. But ETCs also explain stable, age-discrepant relationships.
Such as the older man pairing with a younger woman.
Exactly. A 30-year-old woman and a 50 to 55-year-old man can achieve transactional parity if the older man offers significant commitment, accumulated wealth, and social capital, which compensates for the woman's declining, though still present, relational value. The exchange is stable because both parties are offering peak value in their respective domains.
And the marriage data suggests that long-term stability is linked to a subtle structural asymmetry in the initial pairing.
Studies on marital success consistently show the highest stability is linked to a modest but consistent 2-3 year male age advantage in first marriages. This structural asymmetry is strategic because it ensures the woman initially perceives her partner as slightly higher status or competence, allowing her to look up to her partner. This initial respect and perception of upward mating buffers the relationship against hypergamous dissatisfaction over the decades.
And as people age and experience divorce, that optimal gap actually increases as a continued hedge against volatility.
It's a rational market adjustment. The optimal gap shifts to 5-7 years for second marriages, and often 8-12 years for third marriages. The man, in these later life pairings, is maintaining consistently higher relative value through accumulated resources and status, which is a necessary hedge against the predictable SMV trajectory of the female partner.
Before we move on, we have to address the most controversial economic framework applied to human sexuality. Sexual economics theory. Let's say. We have to report on this neutrally, acknowledging both its claims and the severe foundational criticisms it faces.
This is a contentious area. The theory, as proposed by some behavioral economists, fundamentally claims that sex is a resource that women inherently hold and men inherently want. This leads to a natural bargaining power imbalance where women negotiate sex for commitment, love, or resources.
And proponents use current, high-visibility examples to support this idea.
Yes. They cite examples like the demographics of the sugar baby phenomenon, where a large majority of sugar babies are younger women providing time and sometimes sexual access in exchange for financial support from sugar daddies. They also cite extreme historical examples like virginity auctions or cultural practices where a woman's sexual activity is tightly controlled, arguing this proves the commodity nature of sex.
But the theory is regarded by most academics, particularly anthropologists and sociologists, as an outmoded fringe theory. What are the primary critical counterarguments that essentially undermine the theory's foundations?
The criticism is profound. First, the theory suffers from severe cultural bias. It relies heavily on self-report data gathered primarily from historically patriarchal and sexually restrictive Western societies. It completely neglects matrilocal or matrilineal counterexamples in history and anthropology where sexual behavior differences are minimized or where women hold significant social and economic power.
And the second major criticism is just a simple matter of mathematics.
It's the mathematical impossibility issue. The core claim that men are universally more promiscuous breaks down under arithmetic. If men and women exist in equal numbers, the average number of sexual partners must, mathematically, be roughly the same for both genders. The fact that surveys consistently show men reporting significantly larger numbers of lifetime partners is evidence of biased and dishonest reporting, social desirability bias, not biological reality.
So the historical Western paradigm of the horny male, coy female is more of a cultural construct that served the social agenda than a biological universal.
That is the consensus critique. Studies show the modern Western sexual paradigm was largely ideological, not scientific, arising in the 18th century as part of the construction of bourgeois morality focused on property and lineage control. Non-Western societies have historically characterized male and female sexual drives as far more similar, sometimes even viewing female libido as stronger. Set, in this context, is seen as retro-projecting culturally bound Western phenomena onto all of human history.
Okay, so let's bring this all home. If the macro-social system is failing, the romantic market is rigged and hyperinflated, and our own biology is being exploited by technology, what is the viable, rational response for the individual navigating this great fracture? It seems the only path forward is an internal strategic shift where the individual has to assume psychological sovereignty.
Sovereignty is the complete reclaiming of control over one's emotional and attentional landscape. It means abandoning the external definitions of self-worth that the dysfunctional market imposes. And it starts with developing stoic apathy.
Stoic apathy not as indifference, but as emotional detachment from anxiety and external expectations.
Exactly. It means achieving detachment from the overwhelming social expectations, family pressures, and the constant consumerist and erotic anxiety broadcast by the media. Your inherent value must be defined internally, independent of the market's collapsed pricing system. You must stop caring what the external world, the dating apps, the family members, the social peers thinks you should be doing.
This requires a complete identity shift, doesn't it? Abandoning the old model of self-worth being dependent on external roles, the provider, the husband, the boyfriend, and transitioning to what we call the transcender.
The shift from provider to transcender is monumental. You cease to define your purpose as being a utility for a system that has offered you a negative NPV. Instead, you recast your resources, your time, and your energy into the eternal growth of self-power. And this has 4 core components.
First, the development of will.
Developing an indomitable will, the ability to act contrary to comfort and immediate desire. This is the foundation of self-mastery. Second, the accumulation of disposable wealth. This is not just hoarding. It is accumulating wealth beyond necessity, specifically to buy freedom of action and movement.
Third, building cognitive frameworks.
Building cognitive frameworks means rigorously training your mind to see past the surface reality, to see the Gini Coefficient in the dating app, the NPV in the marriage contract, and the evolutionary mismatch in the addiction. It is about intellectual clarity over sentimentality. And finally, maintaining emotional detachment, the stoic apathy we just discussed. Self-worth is now entirely dependent on internal metrics of competence and freedom, not on being needed by others.
This philosophy sounds beautiful, but how do we implement it in the daily grind of the behavioral sink? This calls for a practical strategy of self-preservation, what we've termed monk mode.
Monk mode is a disciplined, tactical withdrawal designed to recalibrate your internal compass against the crushing psychological pressure of the modern world. The priority is digital noise reduction.
This means being surgical about what you consume, using AI as a tool, not a companion.
Absolutely. AI should be used solely for efficiency, learning, and automation. It is a utility, not an emotional substitute. You must aggressively curate your media inputs. Delete the high-noise, low-utility social media feeds. Filter the news for objective data points rather than emotional outrage cycles. This is about creating quiet, internal space where genuine, effortful thinking can occur rather than reacting to constant external stimulation.
And the cornerstone of monk mode, and really survival survival in the modern environment is dopamine regulation. We have to retrain our brain to stop seeking those high-dose, easy pleasure hits.
This requires strict, non-negotiable discipline. You must strictly control all sources of cheap, instant dopamine. That means aggressive pruning of short videos, avoiding pornography, eliminating shallow social interactions designed only to kill time, and reducing high-sugar, high-fat processed food.
Why is that regulation so critical to the transgender identity?
Because that energy, the time and attention released by controlling dopamine, must be deliberately redirected toward long-term compounding activities. These are activities where the effort is high, but the reward is delayed, cumulative, and builds genuine real-world competence. We are talking about serious, rigorous reading of foundational texts, skill acquisition in a tangible field like coding or a craft or mechanics, achieving measurable, difficult physical fitness goals, and engaging in deep creative work.
These activities build a type of value, self-sufficiency and competence that cannot be devalued by the sexual market, the political system, or the media narrative.
That's the key takeaway. Real-world competence and self-sufficiency are the ultimate non-devaluable assets. By choosing this monk mode, this rational self-focus, you are shifting your value from the external, asymmetrical, and collapsing market to the internal, sovereign, and accumulating self. You are exiting the rigged game.
The 2025 Great Fracture is an agonizing process, but it serves as a harsh filter. It is filtering out those who cling to the outdated map of societal expectations, who believe the game is still fair, or who trust that their traditional value will be recognized. For the individual, the collapse is not an ending. It's a painful systemic reset that demands a radical, rational self-focus. The ultimate survival hack is realizing that when the established rules no longer serve function or dignity, the most powerful response is to entirely rewrite the personal rules of engagement.